Hello. Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is Kagiso Molope, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Ottawa International Writers Festival, Canada's Festival of Ideas since 1997. Tonight, as part of our 25th anniversary season, we're asking, what would freedom look like? I want to begin by thanking you for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street in Ottawa. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, please consider making a charitable donation and also buying some books from your local independent bookseller, wherever you are. We're broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. At the festival, we recognize our duty as settlers on this land to work to repair the harms perpetuated upon First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous peoples, and we acknowledge the ongoing trauma colonialism continues to inflict. The word freedom is used so casually, almost flippantly. Sorry, I think I got. Did you hear that? Did I get interrupted? Something wrong with the audio? Okay. I'm sorry. I'm just going to continue. Okay, so the word freedom is used so casually, almost flippantly. The free market, free speech, freedom of assembly, and yet who thinks twice about no shoes, no shirts, no service, or washrooms are for customers only? We're told some protesters even need to get permits. So clearly, whatever freedom means to each of us, we also accept that some personal limitations to our autonomy may be necessary to ensure broader freedom is in place. Tonight, let's take a closer look at what we mean when we say freedom and what real freedom might feel like. I'm very excited about this conversation as someone who grew up in a conflict zone and a place where freedom was spoken about and fought for many years under apartheid. So I'm very excited to talk to these great writers and thinkers. And so let me just introduce who I'll be talking to. Rinaldo Walcott is a professor in the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto and the author of numerous books, including On Property, Policing, Prisons, and the Call for Abolition, and The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Black Freedom. Clayton Thomas-Muller is a member of the Treaty 6 Cree Nation and works as an environmental campaigner for 350.org. His best-selling memoir, Life in the City of Dirty Water, a Memoir of Healing, was a finalist for this year's Canada Reads. The author and activist Mona Eltahawy can be found online at feministgiant.com and is the author of The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls and Headscarves and Hymens, one of my favorite titles, and the forthcoming novel, and the forthcoming Bloody Hell and Other Stories, Adventures in Menopause from Across the Personal and Political Spectrum. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's conversation. So let's begin with, what I think is sort of the central question, and then we'll flesh it out a little. I just want to ask you, what is freedom to you as an activist, as a global citizen? What does freedom mean to you? And let's start with you, Ronaldo.
Okay. First, thank you for having me and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really happy to be here with Thomas and Mona and and you to discuss this. What I think is an always ongoing urgent question. What do we mean by freedom? To be honest, I generally come to freedom through thinking about on freedom. So I'm always interested in looking at all of the ways in which what we might want to call freedom is constantly being interdicted by all kinds of violences, by all kinds of supremacies. But I'm going to venture a little bit into the terrain of what I think freedom is for a second, which is to say that for me, and largely when I'm thinking about freedom, I'm thinking about Black people and how Black people are able to move through the world. That freedom for me is about a certain kind of bodily autonomy, a certain kind of bodily sovereignty. It's about being able to navigate the world outside of all forms of violence, whether this be physical, verbal, and so on. And it's also about being able to navigate the world on your own terms as long as you're also not engaging violence on others. So, freedom for me is very much about a particular way of owning the world, about a particular way of moving through the world. And of course, for Black people, from the way in which I come to this, that also means an anti capitalist world, an anti imperialist world. It means a world in which all forms of domination are vanquished. Um, and I can say some more about how I see that showing up for Black people or not.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we'll get back to it. Clayton, do you want to tell us what freedom means to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with everything already said. Um, and similarly, I see the world through the lens as a Cree man. My worldview and my cosmovision um, is through that lens, and the shared kind of perspective and experience of Indigenous peoples. And I think that, for me, when I think about what freedom means, and some of the challenges that we face today collectively as members of the Five Fingered Nation, humankind, um, we can get into reductionism and this and that. But I think that, our worldview and our cosmovision very much dictates how we perceive the concept of freedom and how we go about attaining freedom. You know what I'm saying? And Indigenous peoples, similarly to our relatives, our Black relatives, we're actively engaged in an anti-colonial, anti-imperial, like social movement strategy to turn things around and to um, get back to a place where our connection to the sacredness of Mother Earth as Indigenous peoples can, go forward into the future in a way that's unmolested and uninterfered by, the settler colonial state government of Canada, its provincial or territorial or municipal affiliates, and of course the private sector and state-owned corporate infrastructure that they're partnered with in the extraction of raw resources from Indigenous lands across this country that they call Canada and other settler colonial states as well. And so when I think about freedom, for me, it means a lot of things, but I think that a big one here in this country for Indigenous peoples is stopping police violence in our communities and the criminalization of Indigenous land protectors and water defenders. It means, converting the existing pipeline to prisons that exist in Canada for Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous youth, to pipelines to Sundance and other healing ceremonies for Indigenous youth and the broader Indigenous community that's still very much being impacted by colonization and the social and economic crisis that has been, spiraling out of control in our communities as a result of this. Um, it also means like Indigenous peoples that are, this connection that we have to Mother Earth through our hunting, fishing, harvesting, and gathering practices of our medicines and things like berries, and that our ceremonies, are not interfered with, by these colonizing bodies that exist. And it means collectively as human beings, through relationship and connection and experiencing life together in a good way, that we start looking at the world through the perspective of us instead of me. This hyper individualization is very anti-freedom that capitalism currently is perpetuating in our circles. And I think very personally, and I'll end on this note for this opening, is that freedom to me means the graves of my ancestors seeing the light of Grandmother Moon again when we decommissioned the mega hydro dams in the north that destroyed our rivers and our lands, and to see those lands return back to their original state. I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Clayton. Mona, what do you think?
Thank you, Kagiso. I love what Ronaldo and Clayton said, and I fully endorse everything they said. And I'm so pleased to be on this panel because of the array of opinions we have. And to answer your question, I'm going to begin with the way that I always begin my appearances and my discussions, whether it's virtual or in person. And you might know this, Kagiso, because I said this when we last met in Lagos, Nigeria, during a literary festival there. And I always begin with, my name is Mona Eltahawy. My pronouns are she, her, and this is my declaration of faith. Fuck the patriarchy. And that sentence is the way that I begin to define freedom, because, you know, I tie myself to my pronouns, and I tie myself and my pronouns to basically the revolutionary impetus of my life, and that is to destroy patriarchy. And by patriarchy, I want to define patriarchy the way that I see it, because I think a lot of people confuse patriarchy with men, and I do not want to destroy men. I have no fight with men who are interested in also destroying patriarchy with me, because there are also women who uphold patriarchy. So what do I mean by patriarchy? By patriarchy, I mean a system of oppressions that upholds male dominance. And this is, and I like to describe it using the analogy of an octopus, because freedom for me is destroying this octopus that I call patriarchy. And each one of the tentacles of the octopus is one of those oppressions that together form that system of oppressions that keeps up the head of the octopus. The head is patriarchy. So what are the 8 tentacles? Because that's what my revolutionary impetus is, that what my drive for freedom is. Each one of the tentacles largely depends on where you live in the world, because I believe that patriarchy is the oldest form of occupation around the world. It is an occupying force everywhere, regardless of where you live. So one tentacle is racism and white supremacy. One tentacle is misogyny. Another tentacle is homophobia, transphobia. Another one is capitalism, ableism, ageism. Basically, all of the forms of oppressions that ensure that unless you are a rich, privileged, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual, very conservative white man, life on this earth is basically a struggle to be free every day. And how I translate that personally, you know, in the way that I destroy the patriarchy, is I often say everything I do is political. So the way I eat is political, the way I fuck is political, the way I dress is political, the way I present is political, my hair is yellow for a reason, all of that is political. So I am queer, I am polyamorous, I am anarchist, and those 3 things specifically are my political philosophies that help me in my revolutionary fight against the patriarchy. So because I'm an anarchist, I'm anti-capitalist, I'm anti-imperialist. I want to abolish the police, the prison industrial complex, and by extension, of course, the military, because all of those are forms of caging that imprison us all. And by being queer and polyamorous, I want to dismantle and destroy the way patriarchy controls our bodies, controls our sexuality. Sexuality is plural and controls the way that we are able to love, who we can love, how we can love, whether we are deserving of love, and our bodily autonomy. And I specifically talk about polyamory because I think that, and ethical non-monogamy, because I think that a lot of people, when they talk about various forms of what they call alternative sexualities, I do not approach this as an alternative to anything. I approach it as a form of being free. I do not want to own anyone, and I don't want to be owned by anyone. So I think under all of that rubric, you know, those are all the ways that, you know, I often say I wake up every morning convinced that I'm going to destroy patriarchy today, and I go to sleep every night knowing that it will probably not be destroyed in my lifetime. But what happens between the morning and the night is my revolutionary struggle to be free. And I will end with something that one of my heroes, Nina Simone, said about freedom, because there's a wonderful interview that she gave that I'm so glad to see make the rounds on social media quite often, where she's asked, what is freedom to you? And she says, freedom is like being in love. You can't define it. How do you define being in love? You have to feel it so that you can understand what it is. And she kind of like ad-libs, and then she goes, I'll tell you what freedom is. Freedom to me is no fear, no fear. And so for me, when we destroy patriarchy, we liberate ourselves from the fear that each of those oppressions, that together, privilege, male dominance, basically cage us and prevents us from being free.
Thank you, Mona. And you know, I think that's a really great way that, you know, to lead me to my next question. You know, I think all of your answers, you know, have shown that none of you feel that you are living in a state of freedom at the moment, or that, you know, our people, your people, everybody's people are freedom. So my question is, let's get a little bit more personal. I want to know, you know, everybody has a moment they remember, a time they remember from childhood. I remember this, having grown up in a place of, in a conflict zone. Everybody has a moment where they can go back and remember that they were not free, or that they were not, you know, that they were not living in bodies that allowed them to be free. And I just want to hear, you know, for the audience, if you can tell us about what that moment was for you. If you go back, how far do you go back? You know, what was that place where you started realizing, oh, you know, the world doesn't allow me the same freedoms as it probably allows somebody else. And when was that for you, Mona?
Oh gosh, there's so many instances, but you know, one of the earliest instances, and I want to also say that anyone who has experienced sexual assault or sexual violence in any form, I'm issuing a trigger warning just in case someone in the audience is a survivor of sexual violence, and I'm sure many are. You know, when I was 4 years old, so I'm from Egypt. I was born in Egypt, but I've lived in many different countries. And when I was 4 years old in Cairo, I was standing on a stool so that I could see my 4-year-old friend who lived across the street from me in our neighborhood in Cairo. And we were that small. That's why I'm mentioning the stool. And it was a quiet afternoon, and we were talking to each other. It was a narrow street, and this car pulled up, and a man came out of the car and literally pulled out his penis to 2 4-year-old girls. And he beckoned for us to come down to the street. I was so small that I needed to stand on a stool to be able to see my friend from the balcony railing. And this man kept beckoning to 2 4-year-old girls to come down while he was flashing his penis. Now, 4-year-old me understood that there was something very wrong that was happening. And we have in Egypt, when you hold up your slipper to someone, you're basically admonishing them and disciplining them, you know. So I bent down and took off my little slipper and I waved it at this man because I was convinced that I could scare him away because he was doing something wrong to me and I was not going to put up with it. And I did. I waved my slipper at him until he drove away. And that moment has never left me, even though I was 4 years old, because I wasn't able to articulate what was going on and why it was wrong, but I understood on a visceral level that it was wrong. And this is how basically we have to navigate this world that is so patriarchal, that privileges male dominance, like I said, and that enables and entitles a man to think that he can sexually assault 2 4-year-old girls in this way in broad daylight in the middle of the street.
Yeah. What was that moment for you, Ronaldo?
Yeah, this is a hard one for me because I guess, as I said earlier, it was a kind of the question of on freedom is how I come to this problem of freedom. But I guess, you know, as a kid who was born in Barbados and lived there for quite a while, but I remember distinctly in the late 1970s seeing dreadlock Rastafarians being taken away by mental health workers for smoking weed, for railing against the ongoing conditions of colonization, for railing against the ways in which a certain sense of or lack of Black consciousness impinged itself in all of the social relations and being marked as mad for wearing their hair dreaded, for smoking weed, for wanting to live collectively, um, and so on. And it's in that moment that I begin to see that something that I would now call unfreedom was beginning to shape my consciousness. So for me, Rastafarianism, one of the reasons I wear dreadlocks is that Rastafarianism represents a potential kind of freedom. You know, in ownership of our hair, letting it go wild, as people might say, it's a glimpse into what freedom might be. This kind of bodily autonomy that I kind of hinted at earlier. But of course, you know, in the most recent moments for me that catalyzed the profound sense of unfreedom is the manner in which Black people all across the globe are subject to all forms of violence, including physical violence at the hands of police, at the hands of other people who live in the same vicinity that they live in, at the hands of the state, at the hands of U.S. empire, at the hands of European power, at the hands of the neo-colonial rulers in the places that many of us were born, and so on. And so, for me to kind of witness in this moment from this place the tremendous forms of violence, physical and otherwise, that come at Black people day in, day out, really animates for me the problem of freedom. And as you open this panel by saying how this word freedom is thrown around so loosely and so easily when so many of us are living within the captivity of unfreedom.
Absolutely. Thank you. Clayton, when was that moment for you?
I mean, there's just been so many. I always say when you live in Canada and you're born Indigenous, you know, your life is political, no matter which way you slice it. And at the earliest of age, you know, you're exposed to the lack of freedom, the lack of mobility of rights, and a very disproportionate exposure to just danger and a potential to fall through one of the big jagged cracks in Canada's social safety net, you know. And so I think for me, like as far as consciousness and kind of like identifying like how rigged the system is against people of color and Indigenous peoples, was when I was a juvenile. I was a teenager, and I went to juvenile detention. I turned 17 years old in a juvie, and you know, when I was in there, I witnessed a lot of young Indigenous, just children, really, you know, very very young teenagers, get seriously abused physically, psychologically, and I would even say spiritually, in this facility, not just by other prisoners, but by the actual employees of this state-owned, you know, juvenile detention facility. And I remember at the time, you know, I found a copy of Malcolm X's autobiography in the library, and you know, I held on to that book and I read it about 80 times. I was just a teenager, but I just thought it was the coolest thing ever because my mom had actually got that book for me when I was just like a child, and it really helped me through the experience to read that story over and over again. And by the end of my time there, we had, you know, the Native kids in the unit I was in and we had organized together and challenged the bullies of the unit, which were two white kids, and who got preferential treatment by the guard, for kind of maintaining control. And we told them that there wasn't going to be any more bullying, and that we were all going to share the TV room and shows, you know, choosing what shows we'd play. We would do that in a peaceful way, and that there was going to be peace. And for the last month I was in juvie, and all us young Native kids were standing united for peace, and we organized ourselves in a way. There were no fights and no violence in the unit during that time, and not just for us Natives, but for all the kids that were in there. And you know, and it was actually fun on movie nights, and and you know, going to the school inside the jail and stuff. The tension was so much lesser, and I think that was one of the moments in my life where I saw the serious gap that exists, the way the system's rigged against brown and black and indigenous peoples, and we did a little bit in the moment that we could to make it just a little bit better, so we weren't doing the work of our oppressors for them. And you know, the rest is history.
Thank you. You know, you've all three talked about moments that sort of made you feel a lot of anger, a lot of rage. And I want to talk about freedom and rage. I want to talk about freedom and anger. Mona, in you talk about how anger has fueled a lot of your work, right? And I am always very, you know, both in awe of and also just really wondering what it's like to be as vocal as you are about your anger. And for me, as a Black woman, I feel I have let this narrative of the angry Black woman really oppress me in a lot of ways. And it's something that I'm working through. It's something that I'm trying to come out of. And I'm trying to, so I just want to hear from you, how you move through the world expressing your anger so freely, so, I would say, from my point of view, so comfortably. I'm very curious about that. I'm very much in awe of it. I'm very admiring of it. And it's very liberating for someone like me who's always afraid to be the angry Black woman, So let's talk about anger and freedom and the freedom to express anger. What are some of your thoughts on that?
My answer, of course, has to acknowledge that I am not a Black woman. I'm a woman of color, but my entry point into anger is going to be very different than a Black woman, and I have to acknowledge my own privilege of being able to express anger in a way that a Black woman would face many more consequences than I would. In the United States, across the world, we recently, for example, in the UK, we recently heard about a girl called Child Q who was assaulted in a horrendous way in her school, sexually assaulted by police in her school. And, we many people became familiar with the term adultification, the way that, as young as 5 years old, Black girls in the United States are treated as adults, so that when they do express anger, they are punished in a way that white girls and girls of color are not. So I cannot talk about my anger without first acknowledging that I am not subject to the consequences that a Black woman is subject to when she is angry. So I understand where you're coming from, Kagiso. Of course I do. Having said that, I think that my anger found permission in a way because my mother is very angry. And I'm really glad that my mother is really angry. I grew up watching my mother arguing with people, really freely, wonderfully. Whenever she felt that something was wrong, she would argue with them. So I grew up understanding, because she modeled it for me, that when something was wrong, you had every right to challenge it. Whether it was, so my family is from Egypt, but we moved to the UK when I was 7. And I remember my mother was in daily fights with bus drivers in Glasgow, Scotland, because she believed that they were fucking her over with the fare. And she got the head of the bus company in Scotland to come to our house and apologize to her. And I was like, fuck yes. And he was the brother of one of my teachers at school. So my mother modeled that for me. And then the more I made my own way through the world, the more I understood that that incident when I was 4 years old was not isolated, because I have been sexually assaulted more times than I can count. And I had to teach myself to move my anger at what was happening, at the physical violations I was being subject to, from this anger inside to an anger outside. And I began to teach myself to yell at men, and then spit at men, and then smack and shove men, to fast forward 2018 in a club in Montreal, where I beat the fuck out of a man who sexually assaulted me. I literally beat him up. I sat on him and I punched him about 12 times. And I am not a pacifist. And I am all for violence when you need to be violent. And I beat that man up until he ran away. And so my anger has transformed from an internal anger to an external anger, because I recognize that a world that is so unjust cannot be met with politeness or civility. This is also why I swear, why I say fuck the patriarchy at the beginning of every event. And I don't believe in speech, because I believe that those of us who are marginalized in whatever way we are marginalized, whether we are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or queer, or women, or disabled, or older, all of those things that marginalize us, we are further oppressed by this insistence by the state, by the streets, by the systems that, the systems of oppressions, that we're polite in response to our oppression. I'm like, fuck you, I'm not going to be polite. And like to sum it up, and just to show you that I think that so many white people are living under the delusion that even after, and this pandemic is not over, so when I say after, I don't mean the pandemic is over, but even after the trauma of this pandemic, in which we have seen disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and brown people suffer more than white people are under the delusion that as we leave our homes to emerge into the world, that we are somehow unchanged, that we are going to continue to be polite to them. And as a small example of that, I was out to dinner with my beloved in California a couple of weeks ago, and a white woman was sitting next to us, very close, on a table next to us, and she started talking about us in a voice loud enough where I could hear. And I asked her if she had a problem with us, and she said, yes, actually I do. And that was the beginning of the problem for her, because I unleashed anger on her that she did not expect. So take a Karen and multiply this Karen by all the pandemic trauma and fuckery that we have experienced. And she gave me a channel through which to pour the rage that has built in me during this pandemic into this woman who somehow thinks we have emerged into a world unchanged. So I'm a massive proponent of anger. I recognize that not all of us can access anger, that we stand on very, very unlevel playing fields. But for those of us who can access our anger and channel it and oppose those who have the nerve to think that we are going to be polite in the face of their oppression, we must. I think we're obliged to use that anger to begin to chip away at those systems of oppressions.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Ronaldo? Clayton, you talked about Malcolm X, who is seen as a figure who was very angry. I mean, my consciousness also began with, I was listening, I had the story I tell where I used to do my hair, and the hairdresser would close the door and would turn on bootleg tapes of Malcolm X speeches, and this is how I came to know Malcolm X before I read his book. So what are some of your thoughts on anger and activism?
I mean, I just on a personal level, I lost about 150 pounds in the last few years because I got diabetes, like a lot of brown and Black people do when they get a little older. Can't process that sugar in the Western diet. But point is I've been a big Native man my whole life. I've been 300 pounds plus, and just really worn that label of angry brown man in so many different spaces, and been like, just gone through hundreds of experiences of especially like there was a real funny kind of trend online there with this thing around the tears of white women. And I've been in those movement spaces where social movement leaders are getting together and they're talking, about what we're going to do and how we're mobilizing the grassroots people and trying to change things, turn things around, and then something doesn't go someone's way and they use tears and they make you feel like you're somehow oppressing them or something. And I think as I've gotten older, and I just wrote this book. It was a memoir about growing up Indigenous in one of Canada's inner cities. And, the process of writing that book and recounting a lot of these types of experiences around the perception of brown and Black anger as a way to neutralize us, to shut us off, to stifle our voices, in shared spaces. It was a good opportunity to kind of bring back the 20 or 30 Claytons that I've created over the decades to make other people, particularly white people, comfortable. And so I really feel, what was said just now about feeling the freedom to express yourself, and to do that. Now, as an organizer, I can't always like lose my shit on somebody, but I do very, very strongly agree with being straight up with people and just shooting straight from the hip, especially if you're an organizer that's accountable to community. You got to represent where the community's at and move at the pace of the community. When you're building strategies around community self-determination, and I think there's a whole kind of duality that exists in these multiracial kind of contexts like Canada, where you got 80% of the population that is presenting white. They're presenting as European settler backgrounded people. And then you got about 11, 12% Black folks. And then the rest are migrants, immigrants. And I think 5%, just under, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And so a lot of the racism, systemic, interpersonal, or internalized in this country, continues to just persist because white folks they use things like anger, like this false, like this weird victimhood narrative about the angry brown or Black person to not actually change things. And it's really frustrating, because there's so many more bigger issues, as far as who's actually suffering from violence and has every right to be, angry. When we look at the situation right now in this country with unmarked graves at residential school sites and murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, it's an epidemic. These are mass traumas rolling out right now in the Native communities, so much bigger than someone who's getting a little turned over an Indigenous or brown or Black person speaking truth. And so, yeah, it's frustrating, but it's something that I think is changing, especially with the young people, and this really amazing intersectional analysis that appears to be sweeping, especially through the younger generations now. And we see that in the big mobilizations with these kids that are, they're super intersectional, and, it's the same kids showing up at all the different protests. So there is something changing. But yeah, some of these problems still persist, especially with the boomers.
Yeah, I want to get back to talking about violence, but first, I want to just one more question about anger and freedom. Ronaldo, I have a friend I was told who writes a lot about Blackness in Canada and the history of Black people in Canada. He lives in Montreal, and I was talking to him about when Baldwin said, to be Black in America is to be living in a constant state of slavery, right? And I want to know, as a Black man, what have been, to what extent can you express your anger, do you feel?
Well, I mean, let's be honest. Black men in North America express their anger in deeply constricted ways. That the whole discourse about the angry Black woman or the angry Black person is a discourse about comportment. And that simply means that in certain kinds of public spaces, we literally cannot express our anger and our rage. But that doesn't mean that we don't do it, because we do. But we know that could come with particular kinds of consequences. So in every moment that as a presenting Black man, you present your anger and your rage in a public sphere, you know that you can be subject to tremendous forms of violence, that you can be literally, physically, and emotionally damaged for expressing anger and rage, which I take as a particular kind of social strength. So, the attempt to position anger and rage vis-a-vis called something called civility is an attempt to discipline us. Civility is a particular form of discipline, and the insistence that we be civil, it's about disciplining us into subordination. It is actually not about making sure that we can actually engage the terrain from a place of strength. And so anger and rage can do that. And so I suspect that, lots of black men, especially middle class black men, we learn how to moderate our voices. We learn how to um, make sure that our voices in certain contexts don't go above certain kinds of octaves. We learn how to sit and push our backs back into chairs so that the sense of this imaginary figure of the angry big black man, even though you might be 5'2", does not dominate a conversation and dominate our social relations with people who are not white. So the kind of question of how anger gets deployed is one that we have to be always keen to recognize. How the bad rap that people try to give anger is to discipline us, to subordinate us, and to steal a potential strength from us, to steal the kind of response that we should actually be given some of the conditions that we're forced to live under, given some of the conditions that we're forced to navigate. Civility is a ruse for keeping in place the banal forms of white supremacy that rule our lives.
Right, exactly. Thank you. I saw you both go. Did you want to add something? Clayton, did you want to say something?
No, I just really appreciated just the reference to just how really subversive a lot of these strategies are, and how deeply psychological these strategies are. The way that racism plays out and capitalizes on just kind of the visceral nature of how we respond to hate and all of that in our community. When it comes in, and the way that that can get turned around. I think that a lot of people don't realize how deeply psychological and intense this whole thing really can be, and how stressful and traumatizing that is. On top of like I said, a lot of our communities are going through collective mass trauma events on a daily basis, and then you've got these microaggressions that play out in the workforce and the movement spaces and whatever spaces that play out on top of all of that. And that's why in this country, until racism, interpersonal, internalized or systemic, becomes a white person's issue, these problems are going to continue to persist.
Right. Thank you. I want to go back to talking about violence because that's really been a hot topic in the past 2 days since the Oscars. And I had my own reaction at first, and then I went all over the place. But I think that one thing that really caught my eye and something that I've really been focusing on is how we're beginning to talk about violence and how we're beginning to define it. I think that's actually been the one take on on the slap that has really caught my attention is who gets to define what violence is and what is violence actually. And just like freedom today, just like freedom from the trucker movement, everybody was talking about what is freedom, what does freedom look like. I think we go around thinking, well, everybody knows the definition of freedom, and then something like this, the trucker, the convoy happens, and now everybody's definition of freedom seems very, very different. So let's talk about violence, and you've talked about violence, all three of you, to some extent, and where are you with that right now? What is your definition of violence, and how do you link it to freedom? Mona.
Well, my book, The 7 Necessary Sins, this is the second sin we're talking about now, because the first sin was anger, and sin number 6 is violence. And, just to kind of give you an idea of what it's like to be a woman who asks things like, how many rapists must we kill before men stop raping us? When I said that, when I talked about the sin of violence, in my book generally on CBC, I was on a radio show on CBC for an hour, and I talked at length. And, you know, the journalist interviewing me really pulled out my questions about violence and what did I mean and all of that. You know, they were white men, because I know they were white, who wrote to CBC and wanted to take the show down, because how dare I incite, in their language, incite violence. And the show, and I was on a TV show in Australia where I said the same thing, and the show was taken down. Australia, an ostensible democracy, you know, supposedly it's a democracy, banned an episode, a TV episode, because I, among other things, I asked, how many rapists must we kill? And all of this was done in, you know, in a hypothetical manner. I asked these questions. I didn't tell people go out and kill your rapist. I asked a question. And people get so unsettled by a woman asking these questions that they ask me things like, or they say things like, but Mona, don't you think violence begets violence? As if I am instigating, now this gets to your question now and the Oscars, as if I am instigating the violence by asking this question, and not centuries of white supremacist patriarchal violence that we've been subjected to. It makes it seem like I'm the one who began the violence by daring to ask, how many rapists must we kill before men stop raping us? And how long must we wait until men and boys stop beating and murdering us, you know? Because that, I tie that to the Oscars and the questions that you said, you know, really interesting questions that came up, because a lot of people, what we're saying, you know, violence isn't just the Will Smith slapping Chris Rock. It's also Chris Rock being misogynist and ableist in what he said against Jada Pinkett Smith. So we are now finally having a conversation about, where does violence begin? Who has a right to be violent and who has a right to respond to violence? So my book, though, I also have to say that my publisher insisted, so my editor insisted on making a lot of statements that I wanted to make as statements, questions, because they would have disturbed people. Because I wanted to say things like, it's time to declare war against patriarchy. It's time to start killing men just for the sake of being men, so that they can see what it's like when we are killed for being women, for being queer, for being trans, for being all of this stuff. And my editor said, this is not going to get published. You have to make this, you have to put question marks at the end. So I am not a pacifist. I think pacifism has very limited avenues through which it can work. But I believe in self-defense. I believe in fighting. I believe in our right to violence in all shapes and form, in all forms that it will take, to dismantle all of those oppressions that keep us unfree, like Ronaldo says, because we are not free. And until we are able, and you know, I go back to what I said about patriarchy being the oldest form of oppression, because, you know, we have recognized the right of liberation movements to use violence to liberate themselves. South Africa, Palestine, Ireland, so many places around the world have used violence against colonizers and imperialists and occupiers. But when women start to say, it is my right, you know, you look at incarceration rates, most women incarcerated in the United States and in Canada and other countries are there because they had the nerve to fight back against a violent man. When a man murders an intimate partner, he gets, in the UK, for example, he gets between 2 to 6 years in prison. When a woman murders an intimate partner, usually because he's been violent against her, she gets 12 to 20 years. So we are talking, again, this is not a level playing field for a woman to be violent and for a man to be violent. And when I start to talk about violence, I'm accused of inciting violence, not defending myself against violence. So it's really important to see where the starting point is, who has a right to be violent, who has a right to define violence, like you said, and who has a right to fight back against violence. And when I beat that man up in the club, a law professor sent me a journal article that she wrote about what she calls optimal levels of violence in society, because she thinks that we don't have optimal levels of violence because of who has the right to be violent. And I'll wrap it up by asking people to imagine a scenario. When a man walks down the street, he thinks twice before he beats another man up. You know, he has to think, you know, can this man take me on? You know, is he taller than me? Is he bigger than me? There are very few men, if any, who stop to think, if I beat this woman, will she beat me back? because that's just unthinkable. No man walks down the street thinking, if I rape this woman, if I sexually assault this woman, if I yell something obscene at this woman, is she going to fight back? Because that just doesn't happen. So that's the world I want. I want patriarchy to fear us. And in this sense, I will say men. I want men to fear me, and to fear women, and to fear queer people, and to fear trans people, so that we get to the stage where any man who even thinks about assaulting me, like that man who pulled his penis out when I was 4, that he is scared to, that he thinks twice, that he thinks, you know what, she might beat me back or she might kill me. And that will be the world where rape ends, because no man will dare then to be violent against us.
Yeah, thank you, Mona. I fully agree. But at the same time, violence isn't only, physical, right? There are different forms of violence that our people endure every day. And I was wondering, Clayton, if you could touch on that, because I think people think of violence as, the slap is the violent part, right? As you said, Mona, people didn't think of the joke as being violent. They thought of the slap as being violent. But there are so many ways that people endure violence every day. So you talked about women, and I'm wondering, Clayton, if you could talk about how the different forms of violence that Indigenous people endure in this country that your average white settler Canadian might not identify or might not immediately identify as violence.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, right across the board, if you take all the Métis settlements, all the Inuit hamlets in the circumpolar parts of Canada, and all 600 plus First Nations, and you overlay over that map, all of the most toxic and destructive industries in the country, whether that's oil and gas extraction or mega hydro development or offshore drilling for oil or mega mining, diamond, hard rock, whatever, big forestry, clear cut operations, mega big fishing. If you take a map of all of those industries, all those big, operations that are contributing to the global climate crisis, that are driving the global climate crisis, you'll see that every one of those industries is adjacent to an Indigenous community. And so when we think about environmental racism in this country, Canada's entire, extractive capitalist economic model, for it to be successful, the way it has been, by their measures over the last, 150 years or so, it's fundamentally tied to Indigenous peoples being dispossessed from our land through, all sorts of different strategies. And, and it's a very real form of violence because they use gunboat diplomacy. Our communities are at the lowest of statistic, at the top of the shittiest statistics ratios in the country, whether it's incarceration or human health, quality of life, high school dropout rates, you name it. And for the most part, the rest of Canada, the card carrying, political party card carrying, tax paying, law abiding Canadians live within 50 kilometers of the U.S.-Canada border, our biggest trading partner. And so the consequences of not just existential threats like climate change and its disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples, if that wasn't bad enough, you've got the impacts that corporations just put onto the backs of local communities they're operating in the form of environmental pollution. And you get cancer clusters, in a lot of these communities, because where are these people eating? They're eating from the land. And, what happens to the land ends up happening to Indigenous peoples who are depending on that land for their livelihood. And so, and then when you got Native folks who are standing up, who under the rule of law, who hold title and sovereignty over their territories, trying to stop pipeline companies from coming through and building pipelines over their salmon rivers and streams, you get paramilitary forces coming in and sicking, police dogs and, pointing automatic machine guns at unarmed women and children who are living legally in their territories, like in Wet'suwet'en or in the Blue River watershed, where they're trying to build the Trans Mountain Pipeline through this Coquetmuck Nation, and so I think it's just really intense when we look at the fact that Indigenous peoples and our livelihood is caught up in some pretty massive geopolitical issues, because Canada is a resource colony to military superpowers across the planet, and that puts huge pressure on Indigenous peoples where these resources that these powers and their interests lie, in these territories. And so it's a great fight, for us as Indigenous peoples, but we're making big progress as far as partnering with other social movement apparatuses out there, and developing analysis and intersectionality, lifting up this very real idea that everything is connected. And so, and I think a huge part of that, and I'll end with this, is what we're seeing right now is this incredible reevaluation of our relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth as human beings. In the Native community, we see this rise of the sacred feminine creative principle and Indigenous women's leadership. And every single fight against big oil or mining or any threat to our territories, it's women that are leading those fights. And I think that's a really powerful thing given our history as predominantly matrilineal societies. There's a horrific imbalance, I think, that this Indigenous-led social movement like explosion, this cultural renaissance that's happening, that's tied to the sacredness of Mother Earth. And it's having an effect on our young people. And there's big things that are happening, big, quick, fast jumps in terms of change. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that there are really incredible and powerful movements happening. And one of the things that makes me hopeful too is that I think Indigenous people across the world are partnering up and making connections, because there are so many similar ideas and philosophies and around land and what it means. And I just want to quickly say that I was once in Eltahawy and I met somebody who greeted me in my language, and I was quite shocked. But I'm San. I'm South African. I'm the Indigenous people. I'm Khoisan. And he said that there's a program between Eltahawy and Botswana, where I speak Setswana, I'm Botswana, where the youth have an exchange where he went down there, and it was so beautiful to be greeted in my language so far from home. And it just made me realize I was really excited to hear about this youth program. And I think it's really exciting that there are so many connections happening across the world where Indigenous people are realizing that we all have to come together to fight colonialism and the effects of it on our people. We have like 1 minute. So I just want to thank you, all three of you, for being here and having this conversation with me. It was such an exciting time to talk because a lot of things have been happening recently. Thank you so much, Mona, Clayton, and Ronaldo. We are so happy to have you. Thank you for coming and joining us at the Ottawa Writers Festival. And I hope everybody buys your books. And I hope to see you in person, all three of you, at some point when everything is open and feels a little more like we can travel some more. So have a good night, and talk to you soon. Bye. Be safe.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.